put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. Argentina's $100 billion Vanishing Act. On a winter night in December 2001, something unprecedented happened in the heart of Buenos Aires. Behind the marble facades of Argentina's most powerful banks, a silent theft was taking place. Not by masked criminals, but by men in expensive suits following orders that would destroy the lives of millions. What unfolded wasn't just a financial crisis. It was the systematic looting of an entire nation's wealth, orchestrated by those sworn to protect it. This is the story of how Argentina's elite engineered one of history's largest sovereign defaults, and the dark machinery of power that made it possible. To understand how a nation commits financial suicide, you have to go back to when Argentina wasn't collapsing. It was thriving. In the early 1990s, Argentina stood as Latin America's shining success story, a business miracle that economists pointed to as the model for emerging markets everywhere. The country had tamed hyperinflation that once reached 3,000% annually, stabilized its currency, and opened its markets to the world. Foreign capital flooded in. International investors celebrated Argentina as the poster child of free market reform. But beneath the gleaming surface, something far darker was growing. A corruption so deep, a deception so vast, that when it finally revealed itself, it would tear the social fabric of an entire society apart. The foundation of Argentina's miracle rested on a single, seemingly brilliant policy: the Convertibility Plan, implemented in 1991 by Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo. The plan pegged the Argentine peso to the US dollar at a 1-to-1 ratio, backed by law. Every peso in circulation had to be backed by dollar reserves. It was economic shock therapy designed to kill inflation forever. And initially, it worked spectacularly. Inflation collapsed from 4 digits to single digits. Economic growth surged. International banks lined up to lend billions to the Argentine government. But here's what they didn't tell you in the glossy investment reports. Pegging your currency to the dollar only works if your economy moves in lockstep with America's. And Argentina's didn't. Behind closed doors in Buenos Aires' most exclusive private clubs, a different conversation was happening among Argentina's political and financial elite. They knew the peg was unsustainable. They understood that Argentina's provinces were hemorrhaging money, that tax collection was a joke, that corruption was siphoning billions from state coffers. But they also knew something more valuable. As long as international investors believed in the miracle, the money would keep flowing. And as long as the money kept flowing, there were fortunes to be made. What followed was one of the most sophisticated looting operations in modern economic history. A systematic transfer of wealth from Argentina's middle class and poor to a small group of politically connected insiders who saw the collapse coming and positioned themselves accordingly. The warning signs appeared as early as 1995, when Mexico's peso crisis sent shockwaves through Latin American markets. Argentina's banking system nearly collapsed. Capital flight began in earnest. Those with connections and knowledge quietly moving their wealth offshore while publicly proclaiming confidence in the system. The government, desperate to maintain the illusion of stability, did what governments always do when facing economic reality. They borrowed more. International banks, led by giants like JP Chase and Credit Suisse, were happy to oblige. They earned enormous fees, structuring increasingly complex bond deals, selling Argentine debt to pension funds and investors worldwide. These banks knew, their internal memos later revealed they knew, that Argentina's debt was approaching unsustainable levels. But the fees were too lucrative to stop. This is the dirty secret of sovereign debt markets. The same institutions lending the money are often the ones profiting most when it all falls apart. By 1999, Argentina's debt had ballooned to over $120 billion, yet the country's ability to generate revenue was declining rapidly. Brazil, Argentina's largest trading partner, devalued its currency, making Argentine exports suddenly uncompetitive. The dollar, to which the peso remained stubbornly pegged, kept strengthening globally. Argentina found itself with an overvalued currency it couldn't adjust, mounting debts it couldn't repay, and a tax system so corrupted by evasion and political favors that it couldn't fund basic government operations. The provinces, starved of federal funding, began printing their own quasi-currencies. Scrip that teachers and government workers were forced to accept as payment, then had to discount heavily just to buy groceries. The social contract was breaking down, but the financial elite had already made their preparations. Then came the first major revelation that would shock even those watching closely. The megaswap of June 2001. With Argentina clearly spiraling toward default, Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo, the same architect of the original currency peg, orchestrated a massive debt restructuring. The government offered to exchange $29.5 billion in existing bonds for new bonds with longer maturities and higher interest rates. International banks marketed this as a solution, a lifeline that would buy Argentina time to reform. But here's what actually happened. The banks themselves were major holders of the old bonds, trading at deep discounts because everyone knew Argentina was heading for disaster. The swap allowed them to exchange bonds they'd bought for pennies on the dollar for new government-guaranteed bonds at face value. Then they immediately sold these new bonds to unsuspecting retail investors and pension funds at a profit. The megaswap didn't save Argentina. It allowed connected financial institutions to escape with their profits while shifting losses onto ordinary investors worldwide. The fees paid to banks for structuring this disaster: over $100 million. As summer turned to fall in 2001, the true horror of what was unfolding became impossible to hide. Bank runs began in November. Argentines, finally realizing their savings were at risk, lined up to withdraw their dollars from banks. In a single week, $1.3 billion fled the banking system. The government's response revealed just how far the corruption had spread. Instead of protecting depositors, they protected the banks. On December 1, 2001, Economy Minister Cavallo announced the corralito, a banking freeze that limited withdrawals to $250 per week. Overnight, millions of Argentines lost access to their life savings. Their money was trapped inside a banking system that everyone knew was bankrupt. But here's what makes this a truly dark business story. The corralito didn't apply equally to everyone. While ordinary Argentines stood in desperate lines outside their banks, while small business owners couldn't access funds to make payroll, while families couldn't withdraw money for food or medicine, the elite were making different arrangements. Investigations later revealed that in the weeks before and after the corralito, billions of dollars were quietly transferred out of Argentina by those with political connections. Major corporations, tipped off by government insiders, had already moved their cash offshore. Bank executives and politically connected business owners used their relationships to facilitate transfers that ordinary citizens were explicitly prohibited from making. Former President Carlos Menem and his associates allegedly moved over $10 million to Switzerland in the final months of 2001. Provincial governors, union leaders, and corporate executives all found ways around restrictions that destroyed the middle class. This wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a carefully orchestrated wealth transfer from the many to the few, facilitated by those entrusted with protecting the system. The streets of Buenos Aires erupted in mid-December 2001. What began as protests became riots. Argentines, watching their life savings evaporate while the elite escaped unscathed, took their fury to the streets. They banged pots and pans in a deafening chorus of rage, the cacerolazo that became the sound of a nation's anguish. They surrounded banks and government buildings. They demanded accountability from leaders who had spent a decade enriching themselves while driving the country toward catastrophe. President Fernando de la Rua, overwhelmed by the chaos his government had helped create, fled the presidential palace by helicopter on December 20th, 2001. In 10 days, Argentina would cycle through 5 different presidents as the political establishment completely collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. On December 23, 2001, Argentina officially defaulted on $93 billion in sovereign debt, the largest sovereign default in history at that time. But the default itself was just the public acknowledgement of what insiders had known for years was inevitable. The real story is what happened next, when the full scope of the deception finally came to light. The new government, desperate to restore some semblance of order, began investigating capital flight. What they discovered was staggering. Between 1998 and 2002, an estimated $140 billion had left Argentina illegally or through semi-legal loopholes exploited by the wealthy. That's more than the entire defaulted debt itself. The money that could have saved Argentina had been systematically stolen by its own elite and hidden in offshore accounts from Miami to the Cayman Islands to Switzerland. Then came the second devastating revelation that would expose just how deep the conspiracy ran. The pesification decree of early 2002. With the currency peg finally abandoned, the government announced that all dollar-denominated bank deposits would be forcibly converted to pesos at the old 1-to-1 rate. But everyone knew the peso was actually worth far less. It would eventually trade at 4 pesos to the dollar. This meant that if you had $10,000 in a bank account, you'd receive 10,000 pesos, worth just $2,500 in real purchasing power. Overnight, 75% of middle-class savings simply vanished. But here's the truly sinister part. Dollar-denominated debts to banks were also converted at the 1-to-1 rate. This meant that corporations and wealthy individuals who owed money to banks saw their real debt burdens collapse. If you owed $1 million to a bank, you now owed just $250,000 in real terms. The policy devastated savers while enriching borrowers, and the largest borrowers were corporations and wealthy individuals with political connections. Once again, the middle class was sacrificed to protect the elite. The human cost of Argentina's collapse is staggering and hard to fully comprehend from comfortable distance. Within months, poverty rates jumped from 35% to 54%. Unemployment hit 25%. Middle-class families who'd spent decades building savings found themselves suddenly poor, their bank accounts frozen or worthless, their pensions destroyed. Doctors and engineers resorted to scavenging trash for items to sell. Hunger swept through neighborhoods that had been prosperous just a year earlier. Suicide rates spiked. Malnutrition appeared in populations that hadn't experienced it in generations. This wasn't an abstract financial crisis discussed in economics textbooks. It was the systematic destruction of millions of lives by a corrupt elite that sacrificed its own people to protect its wealth and power. But even in catastrophe, some profited spectacularly. As Argentina's currency collapsed and assets became dirt cheap, those who had moved their wealth offshore, the same insiders who'd seen the crisis coming, began buying back Argentine assets at a fraction of their former value. Entire companies were purchased for pennies on the dollar. Real estate in Buenos Aires' best neighborhoods sold for prices not seen in decades. Foreign vulture funds, working with local partners who provided intelligence and connections, bought up defaulted bonds for as little as 20 cents on the dollar, then spent the next 15 years litigating to collect full face value plus interest. One fund, Elliott Management, run by billionaire Paul Singer, bought Argentine bonds for $48 million and eventually collected $2.4 billion, a 4,900% return, extracted from one of the world's most devastated economies. This is how modern financial crises work. They're not accidents but opportunities, carefully created disasters that allow those with knowledge and connections to strip wealth from those without. The role of international financial institutions in Argentina's collapse reveals uncomfortable truths about the global economic system. The International Monetary Fund had been intimately involved in Argentina's economy throughout the 1990s, providing loans and policy guidance that encouraged the very practices that led to collapse. Internal IMF documents later revealed that staff economists had warned as early as 1999 that Argentina's currency peg and debt levels were unsustainable. But the institution kept lending anyway, over $40 billion between 1991 and 2001, because admitting the policy had failed would have been politically embarrassing. The IMF's largest loan to Argentina, $8 billion approved in September 2001, just 3 months before default, was widely understood inside the institution to be a bailout for international banks and wealthy Argentines, giving them time to move their money offshore before the inevitable collapse. When default finally came, the IMF walked away, leaving ordinary Argentines to bear the full cost of policies that enriched foreign creditors and local elite alike. What makes Argentina's default particularly instructive as a business story is how it reveals the machinery of modern financial extraction. At every stage of the crisis, those with inside information and connections profited, while those without suffered catastrophically. Banks earned fees structuring unsustainable debt. Political insiders received advance warning to move their wealth offshore. Corporations exploited the pesification to eliminate their debts, while savers lost everything. Vulture funds bought distressed assets and sued for full recovery. And through it all, not a single banker went to jail. Not a single politician faced serious consequences for the capital they'd spirited out of the country. The investigations that promised accountability quietly faded, as those being investigated happened to be the same people conducting the investigations. This is the dark side of business writ large, a system where crisis creates opportunity for the few at the expense of devastation for the many. The psychological dimensions of Argentina's collapse deserve scrutiny, because they reveal how financial catastrophe functions as a form of social control. When you can't access your savings, when your money loses 75% of its value overnight, when you watch your life's work evaporate while those responsible escape unpunished, something fundamental breaks inside you. Trust in institutions, in currency, in the social contract itself, shatters completely. Argentines developed a profound cynicism about their government and financial system that persists today. They learned to keep wealth in hard assets, to never fully trust banks, to assume corruption in every transaction with power. This is the hidden cost of financial crises. They don't just destroy wealth, they destroy the social fabric that makes functioning economies possible. And that destruction serves a purpose for those at the top. A population traumatized by economic devastation is easier to control, more willing to accept harsh austerity measures, less likely to demand accountability from those responsible. Argentina's recovery from the 2001 collapse is often cited as evidence that sovereign defaults aren't catastrophic, that countries can bounce back. And in pure GDP terms, this is true. Argentina's economy began growing again by 2003. But this surface-level analysis misses the deeper truth. The Argentina that emerged from the crisis was fundamentally different from the one that entered it. An entire generation of middle-class wealth was destroyed and never recovered. Social mobility ground to a halt. The gap between rich and poor, which had narrowed during Argentina's boom years, exploded to levels not seen in decades. Those who'd moved their wealth offshore before the crisis, the politicians, corporate executives, and connected elite, were able to return and buy up assets at depression prices, concentrating wealth even further. The recovery, such as it was, restored GDP while cementing a more unequal, more corrupted, more extractive economic structure. The winners won bigger, the losers never recovered. The legal battles following Argentina's default exposed how the international financial system is designed to protect creditors at all costs. While Argentina negotiated restructuring deals with most bondholders, accepting significant losses in exchange for new bonds, a small group of vulture funds refused. Led by Elliott Management, they sued in U.S. courts for full payment. In 2012, U.S. Judge Thomas Grieser ruled that Argentina had to pay these holdouts in full before it could make any payments to the creditors who'd accepted restructuring. The ruling was remarkable. It essentially gave a handful of hedge funds the power to hold an entire nation hostage. Elliott Management seized an Argentine naval vessel in Ghana. They attempted to seize satellite payments. They blocked Argentina from international capital markets for over a decade. The message was clear. Sovereign nations might default, but international capital will extract its pound of flesh no matter how long it takes or how much additional suffering it causes. When Argentina finally settled with the holdouts in 2016, the vulture funds collected billions, a return that dwarfed anything they could have earned through legitimate investment, proving that betting on catastrophe and human suffering can be the most lucrative business model of all. What lessons does Argentina's collapse offer for understanding how power and wealth actually operate in our modern financial system? First, that those at the top always know the crisis is coming before everyone else. They have access to information and analysis that gives them time to protect themselves, while ordinary people remain in the dark. Second, that institutions designed to provide stability, central banks, international financial organizations, regulatory agencies, often serve primarily to protect elite interests rather than prevent catastrophe. Third, that financial crises aren't random market failures, but often deliberate policy choices that benefit connected insiders at public expense. Fourth, that accountability after crisis is largely a myth. Those responsible typically escape consequences, while victims bear all the costs. And finally, that crisis creates opportunity for massive wealth transfers, from the many to the few, concentrating economic power even further among those who engineered or profited from the disaster. These aren't unique features of Argentina's experience. They're the fundamental architecture of how modern financial systems operate globally. Argentina's default sent shockwaves beyond its borders, serving as a warning and template for future crises. The playbook was now visible. Unsustainable debt accumulation, funded by international banks earning enormous fees. Capital flight by connected insiders as crisis approaches. A bank freeze that traps ordinary people, while elites escape. Forced conversion of savings at unfavorable rates. Sovereign default, followed by vulture fund litigation, and years of economic devastation, while wealth concentrates further at the top. We've seen variations of this pattern repeat in Greece, Cyprus, Venezuela, Lebanon. The names and specific details change, but the fundamental structure remains. Each time, international institutions and mainstream economists express shock that another crisis has occurred. Each time, they promise reforms to prevent it from happening again. And each time, the underlying incentives remain unchanged. There's simply too much money to be made in creating, facilitating, and profiting from sovereign debt crises for the system to reform itself. The darkest aspect of Argentina's collapse, the truth that makes it such a compelling business story, is how unnecessary it all was. Argentina didn't default because it was poor or lacked resources. It has abundant natural resources, a highly educated population, rich agricultural land, and sophisticated industries. It defaulted because its elite chose short-term enrichment over long-term stability, Because international banks chose fees over sustainability. Because those with power systematically looted the country's wealth and hid it offshore rather than pay taxes or invest in productive activity. The collapse wasn't an inevitable result of market forces. It was a deliberate outcome of decisions made by specific people who knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway because they could profit while others suffered. This is the recurring pattern in major financial disasters. They're not acts of God, but acts of men, carefully calculated crimes dressed up in the language of economics and policy. Today, Argentina continues to struggle with the legacy of 2001. It defaulted again in 2020 on $65 billion in debt. Inflation remains chronically high. Capital flight continues as Argentines, burned by experience, refuse to trust their financial system. The country lurches between populist leaders promising relief and orthodox economists promising reform, but the fundamental problem remains. An elite that treats the country as a resource to exploit rather than a society to build, and international financial institutions happy to profit from the extraction. The 2001 default didn't teach Argentina's elite or the international financial community any real lessons, except perhaps that there are no consequences for those at the top, that crisis can be highly profitable for those positioned correctly, and that the same game can be played again and again with slight variations. So what happened behind those marble facades in Buenos Aires on that winter night in December 2001? Not a theft by criminals, but something far more insidious. A legal, sanctioned, systematically executed transfer of wealth from an entire nation to a small group of connected insiders who saw the disaster coming and positioned themselves to profit from it. The men in expensive suits weren't breaking the law. They were using laws they'd helped write to legally loot a country's future. This is the vault that broke a nation. Not a physical place where money disappeared, but a system designed to extract wealth from the many and concentrate it in the hands of the few. A machine that runs on crisis and feeds on devastation. And the most chilling truth? That machine is still running right now, in countries around the world, waiting for the next opportunity to demonstrate that in modern finance, the greatest profits come not from building, but from collapse, not from creating value, but from being there with empty pockets when the vault finally breaks open and other people's dreams come spilling out. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.